Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out tonight. I'm Laura Oyen, and I'm on the District 10 board from Subdistrict number 1, which is over by Livingston Nursing Home, Midway Parkway, that area. We are really pleased that we could borrow a little bit of time from the Environmental Committee who met before. I'm also on the Neighborhood Relations Committee, and all summer we've been working with students and faculty at St. Kate's to interview members of the community as part of the Como Neighborhood History Project. So tonight is going to be a presentation by Ava and Casey and their professor, Dr. Neiwert, on what they put together from the summer. One of the things with this project is that last year we did it for the first time, and we're learning as we go. Everyone on the Neighborhood Relations the Neighborhood Relations Committee are volunteer, as well as the Como Neighborhood History Project. It's a volunteer organization. So Marcia and Darlene have been doing a lot behind the scenes too, helping with the Como Neighborhood History Project. So we're just trying to put together stories of the Como neighborhood, a little bit, not necessarily the park, not the fairgrounds, not even this lovely building here, but we're trying to get stories of people who lived in the neighborhood. And we're doing our best to put together things, figure it out. Last year we did Subdistrict 1 with the students that we worked with Dr. Neiwert. And then this summer we did Subdistrict 4, which is between the tracks, the front area. And so we had a really good time learning a new part of Como. I'm hoping next summer that we're going to do Subdistrict 3, and then the summer after that, if it all works out continually, we'll do Subdistrict 2. So we're kind of making a loop around the park to get to know different stories of different parts of it. Through this, both community members and our students have been researching different parts of the neighborhood, buildings, history, stories. So with that, we're going to start the presentation, and following the presentation we'll have a few questions, and then we're going to have go into our Neighborhood Relations Committee meeting, which will be shorter tonight, but everyone is welcome to stay for that meeting. And really appreciate that you all came in. It's so nice to see you all on this rainy evening. So without further ado,
hello everybody. We are really glad to be here with you all this evening. Thanks so much for inviting us and for the work and taking us in as collaborative partners this summer. We really appreciate it. So my name is Rachel Neiwert. I'm an associate professor at St. Catherine University, and I work on a project at St. Kate's called Welcoming the Dear Neighbor with a question mark at the end. And we think that question mark is an important part of the title of our project. So the Welcoming the Dear Neighbor project is an interdisciplinary project that looks at the history of, or not just the history, but looks at the experience of housing inequity and the relationship to racism in Ramsey County. So last summer, we spent a lot of time talking and learning about racial covenants. This summer, we've turned our work a bit to the direction of thinking about schools and how our neighborhoods relate to schools. So in titling our project, Welcoming the Dear Neighbor, we like to think about the question, have we been welcoming the dear neighbor? I always tell people at the beginning that when I look at the history of Ramsey County and think about how neighborhoods were made, I don't think it gives away the end of the story to say the answer to the question is no. We weren't actually always very welcoming to the dear neighbor, but I think as a historian, if we want to think about ways to be welcoming of the dear neighbor in the future, we have to be able to tell the truth about what happened in our history. So the work that I've been doing this summer with Ava and Casey is under the umbrella of a project at St. Kate's, or a program at St. Kate's called the Summer Collaborative Research Program. It's a program that pairs students with faculty to work on a project together. We get 10 weeks to work, which is not a very long period of time. So we're going to share the work that we've done this summer, but it is work that's a bit in progress, right? Because the work keeps going. So we can head to the next slide. So this summer, so tonight we want to tell you about two things. So we're going to talk about the oral history work that we did this summer, which Laura has told you a little bit about already. So our oral histories this summer focused in Subdistrict 4. And as we talk about those oral histories, we're going to share a bit about some of the big themes that we saw that came out in those oral histories. So neighborhood history, nature and the outdoors, safety, nostalgia, and current neighborhood happenings. And then in the second part of the presentation, we'll tell you a little bit about the work related to schools that we've been doing. So I'm going to turn it over to Ava here to start with the first theme, which is neighborhood history. So we can move to the next slide.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Ava. I'm an incoming third year at St. Kate's. I'm a double major in art history and political science with a minor in museum studies. And I'm excited to get started with you guys. All right. So starting with neighborhood history, this is one of our themes that we were able to identify after completing our interviews. These were pockets of old history about the Como neighborhood. Many of our interview questions revolved around learning more about our participants' family histories to see how these histories tie back into the Como neighborhood. One story was showcased on our story map that will be uploaded into the Como District 4 website on Friday, was about the Foley family. So this story was shared by one participant, Scott Anderson, who's a resident at the front high-rise, who told us of his great-grandfather, Foley, who was an Irishman, along with his 4 brothers who immigrated to America and developed Benton County, Minnesota. After their deaths, the Foley brothers were buried in Como's Catholic Calvary Cemetery, which is conveniently right across from where he lives. And then to the right, we have a story that was shared with us by Mike Barnes, who tells of Como's first zookeeper, John Petro, his great-grandfather. He was a Hungarian immigrant who immigrated to Minnesota because of the Hungarian population and found himself working for Como Zoo. These stories add to the depth of Como neighborhood as well as across Minnesota. And through stories like these, we hope to shed the light on the different histories in the Como area. And then we can move to the next slide. So another one of our major themes was nature and the outdoors. When asking our interview participants about their neighborhood, the one thing that was mentioned nearly every single time was appreciation for Como's outdoor amenities. Many residents who chose Como moving into the neighborhood later in their life shared about the nature in the area, as well as the accessibility and walkability of the neighborhood, as these were some of the deciding factors for making the move. Many of our interviews shared stories regarding the lake, as well as visits to Como Zoo and Conservatory. And again, in our map, we share related stories. One, for example, about one shared by Mike Barnes, growing up as a child. In the winter time, he and his friends would go over to the lake when it's all frozen over and skate and watch speed skating competitions. So next, I'll turn it over to Casey.
Hello, I'm Casey. I'm also an incoming third year. I study history and English. If at any point you can't hear me, just let me know. I'm aware I have friends who go really quiet sometimes. So, as my fellow researcher, we have established a lot of what pulled people to this neighborhood were these amazing outdoor environments and also walkability. One thing they emphasized is that they really felt safe in Como neighborhood. They felt like they could go walk around the lake, that they could take their dogs out at any time, and it would be fine. However, we did see some evidence in Subdistrict 4 that it wasn't always the safest. Doyle Lee Miller, our wonderful interviewees who have front row seats, talked about how when raising their 3-year-olds, while everyone in the neighborhood was safe, you know, kids played together and everything, there was definitely some concern over traffic because there weren't stop signs at some of the intersections.
And at least one kid was hit at one point, leading to them and their neighbors, creating a sort of effort to put in stop signs to make it safer. And I believe they noted they had a fight to get four-way stop signs at some intersections. They only wanted to put them in one way, but I'm pretty sure that was not safe. Another thing they brought up was that to go to school, kids in District 4 had to cross railroads. And while they did this as safely as possible with things like crossing guards and crossing in groups, there was still some risk, and notably, cars and railroads were not mixing well. At the time, the railroad crossings would have had shorter arms that cars could get around more easily, which they sometimes did. Not a good choice. You will not win in a car against a train. So another effort that was brought up by both Millers and Cops was that they were working, the neighborhood as a whole was working to one, get trains to stop blowing their horns every time they came through, because it's the middle of the night, that's real annoying. And two, get longer railroad arm crossings to prevent people from getting in the way of trains. With both of which have been done in exchange for closing one of those railroad crossings, but overall, increasing the safety of the neighborhood there. All right. Next slide. So another big theme was a lot of nostalgia, which happens in all of us, I'm sure. Frankly, I looked at my childhood playground and was like, oh, that changed, and I'm not really old enough to feel that, I think. So one big one is that, that I took a picture of, is that the Miller mentioned that when they moved in, Como Lake actually still had dirt walking tracks, and it was a lot less busy on the weekends. Another one that came up a lot was Old Stem, or as some of you may know it, Orchard Park. It's currently home to the Blackhawks Central soccer team, which got 3 soccer fields, 2 tennis courts, and a playground. But before it was Orchard, it was Old Stem, which is incredibly little. There used to be a cemetery there. It was long abandoned by the time it had been made into the playground and park area you may know and love. Don't worry about your kids or your dog digging up any bones. All of them have been removed. It's not a cemetery anymore in any way. Mike Barnes, who we've mentioned before, one of our wonderful interviewees, he grew up playing in that park, and he noted that there were little sports teams for the little kids based on which park he played in. He also noted that even though it was technically Orchard Park at the time, no one called it that. It was just Old Stem. The Millers also called it Old Stem. So clearly the name stuck around long after the cemetery. Slide. All right, so 2 more things. So we want to have the infamous Como Park presidential treatment, which was when Clinton came to the Twin Cities area and decided he wanted to go on a run around Como Lake. Apparently he was infamous for that, just like in the wrong places. And this story comes from the Millers, who tell that the Secret Service was there for a good few days beforehand, kind of scouting out who the regulars were. So Lou got to walk, but one of Doyle's friends who worked the night shift and hadn't been walking couldn't go on a walk that day. And another fun piece of nostalgia was the state fair. Once again, from Mike Barnes, who mentioned how he and a lot of other young men and various people in the neighborhood would sort of man the entrance gates. And at the time, this being 60s, 70s, a lot of people were trying to get into the park and the fair without paying, so they do crazy things like sprint through the gates or climb the fence. He mentioned that one time he actually managed to catch a sprinter, which was an impressive feat. I had to round this whole thing to do it. But mostly, as it turns out, they just made whoever got into the park illegally pick up trash for a little bit, and then we're like, go have fun. Not something you can wait for today. All right, moving from a more distant past of the 60s and 70s to more current happenings. Carol Hampshire recalled that she was part of a group photo taken at the Superfund site at the corner of Front and Reason, the photo right there. The site was created by Appleton Corporation, which sells computer parts. It's since been declared non-hazardous. We don't like it in our polluted site, it's not hazardous anymore, but and it's actually become involved in what started with the launch to Lightning project. Have any of you heard of that? Yeah, season 9. So that's a project designed to create more pollinator habitat in like the cities, in people's yards and such. So, please. right, and then going back to human nature, we were brought up earlier, in a fairly recent Know Your Poem article by Sandra Johnson, I hope I got that right, I could not find the pronunciation, guys. If I didn't, I'm so sorry. Titled The Little Things Are the Big Things, Ellen and Sharon talked about who we had the opportunity to interview, and I did mention this a little bit in our interview, that they had this place called the Duck Point Garden. Oh boy. Which works where they're working to preserve the lakeshore habitat and help people lake healthy, which I think is a really fun thing to do. And overall, you guys have a lot of like little gardening products that I think are absolutely fascinating.
It's really kind of all of you who have shared your time being interviewed. Folks who are interviewed spend about 2 hours with us, sharing and giving us insight into their life and their experiences. And so it's very kind and generous of everyone. One of the things that I have thought that is particularly interesting as I have sat in on the interviews is the ways that you can see connections between what's happening right here in your neighborhood and sort of the wider community of St. Paul and Ramsey County that you're a part of, right? So this notion of the Foley family, right, who helps to establish Benton County, right, creates this connection that sort of moves out, right? The environmental projects and environmental concerns, right, are not just reflective of things that are happening in your neighborhood, but are also reflective of sort of larger things that are happening in the community as well. And it's interesting to think about those relationships, right, as you move from sort of a particular neighborhood to a larger community and see how things go back and forth. And so the interviews, I think, provide really lovely space to make those kinds of connections. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing around the connection between neighborhoods and schools. So the Welcoming with Your Neighbor project, like I said, is an interdisciplinary project at St. Kate's that's looking at the relationship between housing inequity and racism. And I will admit, it perhaps makes us a bit of a bummer of a party guest. So Laura pretty regularly invites us to the ice cream social. We've come, I think this was the 3rd year this year that we've come to the ice cream social. And I always think, like, here we are at your delightful ice cream social at a table, and you get to, you know, walk around and have ice cream. And then there we are sort of waving our hands to say, hey, do you want to, you know, get your ice cream and stop and talk with us about racism, right? But I do think it's really important. So I am not from Minnesota, I'm from the West Coast. I moved here in 2004. When I moved here in 2004, my husband and I purchased our first home together in Northeast Minneapolis. That was the first house that we bought. And I remember thinking when we came here and we were sort of working on that move, that 2 things were true. One thing that was true was that we were moving to this place that everybody said was a fabulous place to live and work and play, right? The Twin Cities. And the other thing that I thought was true was that we would buy a house and we could buy any house we wanted. And the only thing that would limit what house could be our house was how much house we could afford, which is certainly a limitation, like a very real limitation. But right, it struck me that those were the 2 things that were true. And I realize now, when I look back on that, how naive I was and how my own sort of positionality affected what I thought was true of the world, right? So it is true that the Twin Cities is a lovely place to live. And there are lots of places that provide lots of statistics to help us think about how the Twin Cities is a lovely place to live. But those statistics get tricky when you really dig into them. So for example, if we talk about home ownership, in the Twin Cities, roughly 75% of white families own their own home. Only 25% of Black families own their own home in the Twin Cities. And that 50% gap in home ownership is actually the biggest gap in home ownership in the United States. And, you know, I'm not sure, but my impression, as I have given lots of presentations in front of lots of groups, is that certainly for a lot of white folks who live in the Twin Cities, it's not necessarily the way that we think about the place we live, that the disparities are this deep and this large, not just here, but relative to other places, right? It's easy to sort of identify these as problems that are somewhere else, right? In bigger cities, in other places, but they're not, they're problems right here. And that's part of what we're working to sort of uncover in the Welcoming the Dear Neighbor project in a variety of ways. So I'm a historian, so I approach it from a historical perspective, but I work on an interdisciplinary team with economists and folks from public health, folks from sociology, who are also sort of bringing their disciplinary lens and focus to the project. So this summer, one of the things we wanted to think a little bit about on this project looking at housing inequity was thinking about the connection between neighborhoods and schools, right? Because that house in Northeast Minneapolis that my husband and I bought in 2004, where our limitation in buying that house was money, was right, how much house we could afford. But that of course missed the point that, right, our own position as white middle-class professionals gave us access to homeownership in a way that people of color don't have the same access to, right? I wasn't paying attention to that in 2004, but I was paying a little bit of attention to schools. We didn't have any kids in 2004 when we moved into our house, so I paid just enough attention to schools to know that there were schools and our children could attend them. But when I had children, when we had our children, then 3 years later, and they got a little older, and I started to think about schools, we actually moved so that our kids could go to different schools. And I look back on that choice now and think about how, on the one hand, I suppose I was making a choice for my children. On the other hand, I was also making a choice in a way I didn't fully appreciate at the time, to contribute to, right, a sort of continuing divide in schools. So we'll share a little bit about what we learned about schools and their relationship to neighborhoods. So we can head to the next slide. So just as a reminder, I thought I would bring, so this is actually data that some of the economists who've been working on the project have been working on. And we'll need to update this because now that we have data from the 2020 census, we can sort of pull the numbers forward. So this was work done by Dr. Christine West, who's an associate professor of economics. And she did this work with two students who just graduated this past year, Ava LaPlante and Victoria Delgado Palma. And so what they did was look at census data. They looked across all the neighborhoods actually in Ramsey County and sort of came up with graphs like this. And so what you can see here is sort of the racial composition of the Como Park neighborhood in 2000 based on census data from the year 2000, and then based again on census data in the year 2010. So the dark purple color here are white people who live in the neighborhood. This sort of light purple color here is Black people who live in the neighborhood. This, what I've called light blue, because on my computer it looked more blue than purple, but here it is much lighter purple, is Hispanic people in the neighborhood. The light yellow is Asian people in the neighborhood, and the dark yellow is other. The racial categories, because they're using census data, the racial categories come from the census data or from the categories that the census captures. So we didn't pick the titles or the terms here. This is sort of the way the census categorized things. And so one of the things that I think is worth noting here is that if you think about this question, who are the people in your neighborhood? There's a lot of white people in the neighborhood. And while it certainly changes a little bit from 2000 to 2010, it's not as though the whole neighborhood has changed, right? It's still a neighborhood that is predominantly white people in it. And it's interesting, I think, to think about why that is and what might be the legacies of that in the community today. So I know that a lot of folks in the neighborhood have been talking about racial covenants in the neighborhood. right? A racial covenant is simply language added to a property deed that said that only white people could live in this, in a particular home. So Frankston's Como Park Edition, which is roughly, I think of it as sort of a large segment or roughly half of the neighborhood. That was a piece of the neighborhood that when it was established was completely covered in racial covenants. It was one of the selling features. He argued a Frankston's Como Park Edition that only white people would live there. So that of course contributes, that's one reason, that's one way that historically neighborhoods were kept as white spaces. But racial covenants are illegal and unenforceable today and have actually been for a long time. But one of the things we've learned doing this project is that racism is horrifically nimble. And so there's all kinds of other ways to claim space as white space. That includes, violence and harassment against neighbors of color to make neighborhoods unwelcoming to them. Zoning is sort of a modern way that we tend to enforce claiming neighborhoods as white spaces. Often things that we think of as zoning are really just ways to sort of cover up and talk about race, right? So it continues to be an issue. So Ava's going to come and share just a little bit about some work she did in the newspapers to just set the context for what is happening in the sort of larger St. Paul community as historically it thought and talked about race. And then we'll sort of look at the schools more specifically. I see you raising your hand. Can we do questions at the end? Would that be okay? Are you sure? Okay, thank you. You can head to the next slide.
All right. Yes, so another part of our project was researching and looking more in depth at newspapers. So I apologize in advance if I don't make enough eye contact with you guys. I have some important stuff to say that I don't want to mess up. So in addition to oral histories that we explored by interviewing Como District 4 residents, we also collectively reviewed old issues of the Pioneer Press to see what we could learn about the city of St. Paul and how these histories have influenced the current day. So, looking through the year 1922, the Pioneer Press, I felt like I was missing a perspective. Because despite St. Paul having thriving Black communities at the time, the St. Paul Press did not reflect that. Trying to bridge that perspective, I decided to compare a popular Black-run newspaper called Appeal. The Appeal was Black journalism and was writing for Black audiences at the time. It included content revolving around news that represented the Black population for what they were. The Pioneer Press, on the other hand, presented a different story. When comparing the Pioneer Press to the Appeal, I made sure to look critically at what was being said and what was not being said. What were consistent themes in these stories, story placements, charged journalism language, etc. It was evident that the Pioneer Press was a white-run news source, writing for white audiences. In addition to the lack of depth in their printed content related to non-white populations, their content presented a clear agenda to build harmful narratives around non-white populations. Addition to that, they specifically wanted to build harmful narratives around Black people. The most common was to push and to paint Black people as dangerous, violent, and criminals. And even in comparison to white violent crime, they wanted you, the reader, to remember that Black people are threats. Naming Black criminals in the headlines, such as Negro Slayer, their counterparts would be referred to simply as murderers. I want to note that this term Negro is not something that is appropriate to say today. It is an outdated term, but for the sake of this presentation, I thought it was important. Some of these deliberate attempts were not as apparent as this, however, using outdated language to refer to Black people. And you may miss it if you aren't looking for it. So one example that I decided to include of a kind of nimble sense of racism, like what Dr. Neiwert was saying, was the comparison of these news stories about Frank Wheaton, who was a Black lawyer in Minnesota and a member of the Minnesota legislature. In the appeal, they included a picture of him showing everyone who he was. And this is the St. Paul Pioneer Press. They did not include as much as the appeal did. I did not put that in here because you got the whole page. But this is what they wrote for him. And they titled it "Negro Lawyer Dies by Gas." The story was about this man taking his life by suicide. They wrote a short piece on him. However, what is important to look at is the content surrounding this story. Mind you, this story was on an entire page of newspaper. Everyone knows what a newspaper looks like. Story after story after story. However, one story about a Black man who robbed a woman was placed directly underneath this sad story about a man taking his own life, called "Negro Bandit Beats Up Louise Ganger." This placement is a deliberate attempt to undermine the death of a successful Black man, reminding you that even if you have compassion for a man like this, remember he's Black and he's dangerous, and he's capable of dangerous things. These types of things are less overt and something to look out for. However, this was 1922, so why is it important now? Newspapers like these would be read on the daily, and therefore they have influence. They have influenced and developed attitudes that perpetuated prejudices, discrimination, and racism, and more. These attitudes grow in ourselves and in our homes and in our communities. These attitudes affect our neighborhoods like Ngono. To this day, systemic inequalities such as the establishment of covenants and the segregation of our school systems continue to affect minority populations to this day. One thing that I had great appreciation for was in one of our oral history interviews with the Calts. Albert Cal left the interview sharing his own critical assumption of the news regarding the Como District police reports that come out occasionally. He read about a new policy surrounding parking for trucks around the neighborhood. And he questioned who were predominantly driving these trucks. Who did these policies affect? What was he able to read between the lines? What Alfred shared is just one of the modern day applications of this practice, consuming news critically. So, I'll pass it on to
We have the next slide. Yeah. So the work of sort of thinking about the larger context of what were relationships like in the Twin Cities between communities of color and white people in the Twin Cities, I think is really important work that helps to sort of understand some of the more granular and particular things, like looking at schools and school desegregation. So right, just like, the house I live in now, I live in Shoreview, and we moved there for the schools, right? So that there would be, our kids could go to good school. But it is interesting then to think about that connection between neighborhoods and school segregation and school desegregation. Right? So Ava and Casey and I did work in the archives at the Minnesota Historical Society. We looked at papers from the Minnesota Department of Education. We looked at papers from the St. Paul School District. Included there were also some letters from parents and things, so we could sort of see the story from some different perspectives. And what we were wanting to get a sense of is, how did school desegregation happen? We started with the St. Paul schools. That's sort of the story we're starting to track. And we'll keep this research moving forward. So what you get today is a sneak peek of something that's in process, but not done, okay? So this was actually a report that I read that came from June of 1974. And these are the very first sentences of the report. It's about a 20-page report that's reflecting on the St. Paul Public School District's efforts at desegregating its schools. They were facing legal challenges in the early 1970s to move desegregation of the schools along. And so they had tried some new programs and policies, and this report was reviewing what those policies and programs were and how they work. So this is how the report opens. In St. Paul, patterns of housing in neighborhoods have isolated minority and socioeconomic groups. As a result, some schools in the city enroll an almost entirely Caucasian student body. Some schools have high proportions of Spanish surname students. Some schools have high proportions of Black students. I thought this was a really interesting start for their piece because it claims, right, a very sort of clear relationship, right? That schools are segregated because neighborhoods are segregated, right? And if that's why schools are segregated, is because neighborhoods are segregated, then how do you undo school segregation, right? It is in fact the sort of pesky problem that the St. Paul schools are facing in the 1970s, and it is perhaps still the problem we face today. So we're gonna, let's see, we're gonna start with KC, who's gonna provide a little background, and then Ava on some of the solutions, and then questions, I promise, it's coming, okay? You head to the next slide.
All right, so we're going to be talking about the 1970s, but first I'm going to jump us back a little over 20 years, starting with 1949. There's this case called Shelley v. Kramer. Shelley v. Kramer is what outlaws the enforcement of any sort of racial bias. That's 1949. 1954, we have the infamous Brown versus Ford case, which orders schools to desegregate. It takes a little while for that desegregation to go from the dual school system of the South, where they put all the kids who are white in one school and all the kids who are of color in another school, to like trying to look at what's happening in the northern part of the country, such as here. So in 1972, which is 18 years after that, the Brown versus Ford, Independent School District 65, which were a part, sort of covers a lot of the current St. Paul public schools, is starting to try to figure out the segregation plans. Now, as established, and they know this, the schools are segregated because the neighborhoods are segregated. And because children go to the neighborhood school, they end up virtually isolated. How do they fix this? Well, the first thing they tried is busing. And been done in other areas successfully, so they thought, we'll go with the tried and true. So they run out of money for it really fast. They run out of money for it really, really fast. And there's a rising anti-busing movement. In fact, one of the documents I found in the archive was from this organization called PINS, or Parents of Neighborhood Schools. Their stationery had no busing stamp on it. Like, people were really not happy with busing. And also, there's this case coming down the pipeline called Helen versus Bradley in Detroit, where in Detroit, they realized, hey, the city center itself, really racially isolated, and we've got all these white people out in these suburbs. What if we bust between them? No, the Supreme Court says. No, they're not actively enforcing racism, so you can't punish them like that. And suddenly, how do you solve this? If you can't bust the white people and the colored people between areas to make sure schools are integrated and make sure everyone is interacting and, like, you know, trying to dismantle racism through that method, which had been one of the big goals of school desegregation was, hey, maybe it'll tackle racism, because maybe that helped. No one really knows. Probably it does, honestly. So with Helen v. Bradley coming down this pipeline and all these other issues, like, suddenly busing is not viable. So they're trying to figure out some other solution to desegregate schools without busing in the traditional sense. So they come up with this. One of them comes up with an alternative schools act. For sure thing. That is explaining something called a learning centered program. Concept is, you know, some schools have like a better music program or a better like engineering program, I guess. Yeah, the better school program, better engineering program. And also kids have different needs and interests. So it's trying to combine these and say, hey, what if we make these little learning centers in schools tailored to some sort of specific interest, and then send kids there for half the day. So then we'll redistribute the population in the schools, and we'll try to tailor it more for what kids want to learn. At least that's the concept. And what ends up happening is the district ends up getting split into a bunch of these different clusters. You guys are over here in Mercury. And they move between the schools in the cluster. So it's not perfect, it's not entirely district-wide shuffling, but it's an attempt at shuffling. And this is basically the strategy they go with is we'll try this method of shuffling how students are educated, so they spend half the day in these things. And that'll be integrated enough? Is it integrated enough? Does it do anything? Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Can you head to the next slide?
All right, so now we have this question of, did learning centers desegregate schools? In short, while learning centers aim to solve this problem, they were only partially successful. Successful because they got some level of integration into schools by introducing things like busing, open enrollment, and more. However, the legacy of coming into neighborhoods, along with various additional racial inequities faced by non-white individuals, still ground the problem in the fact that many of our neighborhoods still remain segregated. And our neighborhoods are undeniably tied to our schools, like the way that Dr. Neiwert explained in previous slides. So it isn't until our neighborhoods are fully desegregated that our schools can as well. And then if you go to the next slide, we wanted to show you all kind of a present snapshot of what's going on in the high schools. So this is Como Park Senior High School. And then we brought together data of the Black students and the white students within the high school and their graduation rates from 2017 to 2022. So you can see that there is a stark difference between these populations. With white students in 2022 at 90% graduation rate, and Black students at 73% graduation rate. That is undeniably a big difference, and a problem to have when you have basically 7 in 10 Black students graduating and 3 falling to the shore. So this was just one example that we wanted to provide for you all to kind of show how there's this legacy in systemic inequality, and it's affecting our students and our non-white populations today. So yeah, we can close up the presentation.
So this is what we brought for you this evening to just get a flavor of some of the work that we've been doing. The work related to education will continue. I think we have more work to do in the archives and in the newspapers to learn more about the sort of particularities of what happened and how it worked and how it got evaluated and what were the other plans that people tried. Or the other plans that people put on the table that never got tried. But this is sort of the focus of our work for the year, is thinking about this relationship between neighborhoods and education and schools. So we'll keep working on the project. But we're thankful that you invited us this evening to share a little bit of what we've been doing. And we're happy to answer questions, and you should most definitely get to go first since you've waited patiently.
Thank you so much. I moved over here like 20 years ago, and I live in here at Como Park. You know this place? I used to have the church of St. Andrews, because I'm doing a hub for everybody. And I met people, because I don't have family here. I'm Hispanic, you can see. And then they were so welcoming, and I met people from different races, But you're right. Mostly European descendants, but very down to earth, beautiful, making me feel at home. And I have a nephew who's studying in Bloomington, and my husband's is vocation. Okay, he's one of the kids out there. So I met the German teacher taught them, and he said, oh, I just heard that. We are going to buy the school, the church where there is going to be the German school. It's perfect for the kids. So it's in pristine conditions, it's excellent, I saw. So the kids, I was speech German too, and so was related that they were going to move because, I love education. I know in the German culture how they love big buildings, the history, the tradition. That's what German culture is about. And I thought it was going to be like that. She said, oh, we are going to preserve the schools in excellent conditions, pristine conditions. And the rectory was done after that. And they said, well, we're not going to destroy the church. And they destroyed the church. But under false things, they're not going to go into the school. But the reason is that the people, they were not from here. They were coming from Plymouth to here. And they destroyed what it was meaningful to the city of St. Paul. Until now, the neighborhood split over people don't that. They demonize all of us who try to preserve what we consider really is part of the Romanesque construction. It was just beautiful. Besides, our kids, it was part of also, for me, for my family, everyday life. But it wasn't the same thing, now the library, having library too. But then, the park, we have here, in the park, we used to have like 6 tennis courts. We used to come and play, and they say that they were going to remove that and rebuild another one because the floor was cracking. I remember that we used to play. They never put it back. They stole that, something that they was for St. Paul, and they never put it back. But they did beautiful job with the pool, more revenue, more money, and so on. But they never put the ponton without that, I go to Central High School. In Central High School, my kids go first to Catholic school, finish, and then for secondary school or high school, they go to Central. And they were high academics kids, always I am pushing for excellence. And they had the orchestra. So I wanted them to join me, some was violin, the piano. I said, okay, good, go to that. And then other schools, they didn't have string orchestra at Central High. There, the first time the kids started joining that, I heard that there was segregation. I go to school, I am Latin, Hispanic, and rich, poor, work like everybody else. But I have high, how can I say, demands upon myself, expectations, and my kids. So we go there. And I see kids with their pants down in the school, swearing, and just really being boys to each other. So I talked with the director and said, gosh, how can you allow that there is not a dress code? And I think the director told me, where are you from? I said, well, South America, and from the country. And then he said, well, in your country there is no freedom. Here is freedom of expression. What a wrong thing to do. I mean, really, I went to school, and there is right and wrong. The kids, it's just something wrong with education. It's not like, I grew up with people, I have families who are dark, they're Indian, they're European, my family, France, and Spain, German too, so a mix of everything. And we love each other, and we respect each other, and we don't see upon ourselves about racism. And I'm listening to you, you're talking about racism. The more we focus on that, the more we separate that. That's my perception, I may be wrong. I think we have to focus in education, in giving the kids the strength to be who they are from within, besides race. That is what I feel. I don't know. Today I'm listening to that. It's okay, a part of history in the past. But how can we move? You're not going to pass that. That trait, if we just focus in that, I think we have to focus in the person is itself, the character of the person. I'm sorry, but that's not my perception.
That's okay. So I think one of the things that we have wrestled with, so we work with a lot of different faculty, we work with a lot of students as we work on the project, is how do we hold, what do I want to say? How do we hold like intention, or how do we hold equally both the sort of experiences of individuals, how it's, individuals experience their lived life and sort of life in their neighborhoods and life in their communities. How do we hold that together at the same time that we hold the sort of systemic and structural inequalities that exist in our society? Like, how do you balance the two things? And I mean, it's a tricky thing, right, to hold both of those things. I think, I can speak from my experience of what I have learned from my students. So, right, St. Kate's is a pretty diverse school. So I'm regularly teaching in classrooms where most of my students are students of color. And I have learned a lot from my students, which perhaps isn't the way it should be, right? Perhaps that is a reflection of work that I needed to do more of on my own. But one of the things I have learned and heard from my students, particularly my students of color, is there are so many ways that the way I experience the world as a white middle-class woman is very different from the way that they experience the world as young women of color, right? Some of whom, would identify with my same class position, some of whom wouldn't. And right, the question I think for me as I do this work is, what do I do about both of those things, right? What do I do about, I want to empower my students as individuals, but also I live in a world in which there are structures and systems that I think see people unequally. And so again, for me as a historian, I think part of the answer is in telling the truth about our history and about what has existed in the past. And so I have worked with, most years I have somewhere between 4 and 6 students that I'm working with. And I have worked with students in this project, both white students and students of color, who have told me, I never learned any of this in schools. Like that there were racial covenants, that for, a good 50 to 75 years in American history, it was like just okay to write into your housing deed that like only white people could live in their house. They said they never learned about that. That there were, in some presentations I give, I tell the story of Nellie Francis, who's a Black woman suffragist, who in 1924, she and her husband purchased a house in the McRoland neighborhood. I think their house still stands. I can walk there from my office at St. Kate's. It's like an 8-minute walk from my office. And they are the first Black family to move into their neighborhood, and their white neighbors band together to push them out of the neighborhood. In fact, they burned crosses in their front yard. And, if I'm not thinking very hard, like cross burning is something that I put somewhere else, right? I stick it in Mississippi, I stick it in Georgia, I stick it in Alabama. It's not necessarily the thing that I stick here. But in fact, it is a thing that belongs here. It belongs an 8-minute walk from the office that I go to every day. And right, I think about, what does it matter for me as a member of this community, right? When I think about, voting, when I think about being a part of the community, how should it matter to me to know that that is the history of the place where I live? And it doesn't have to be the only history, perhaps, of the place where I live, but it can't be just a forgotten part, I think, of the history of where we live. And so I don't have a perfect answer for you. I can just tell you that this is the way that I think about this work and the way that I think about the sort of connections between the past and the present, and also the ways that I wrestle with each day, making sure that I'm doing good work for and with my students. to help ensure that perhaps there's a different world that they get to come into. Yeah.
Could you mention just briefly, how does zoning take over from redlining? What, because those things do appear on ballots and are talked about, and I'm just curious, what are the cover words that are used to continue that system?
So the systems sort of build on each other and also become ways to replace, right, things that get made illegal. So redlining, which is the process that gets set up by the federal government, right, out of the Federal Housing Administration in the 1930s, it creates these color-coded maps of neighborhoods, and it says that some neighborhoods are good neighborhoods, some neighborhoods are improving, some neighborhoods are declining, and some neighborhoods are declined. And depending on your ranking, it's what determined whether a neighborhood was safe for investment or like safe to give someone a mortgage, right, to buy a house in. If you take those redlining maps and you put maps of where racial covenants were on top of that, what you'll see is that neighborhoods that had racial covenants, so that were for white people only, those neighborhoods were ranked as good neighborhoods and as improving neighborhoods. Whereas neighborhoods that didn't have racial covenants, right, so that were open for people of color to live in, those are often declining or poor neighborhoods. And with the redlining maps, there were actually written descriptions of the neighborhoods that came with those redlining maps. And if you read those written descriptions, often part of the rationale for a neighborhood being a declining neighborhood is that African-American people are moving into the neighborhood, and they like write that down in their rationale. So redlining sort of builds on top of racial covenants, right? But does also in itself become a practice that falls out of favor. And I would say in the post-World War II period, zoning is the new thing that gets picked up, and it gets tried in different ways. Often the sort of zoning requirement that you can only have single family dwellings in a neighborhood, that is often a way to talk about race without talking about race, which is one of the ways that sort of zoning gets used. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna add on to that, there's just recently, the city of St. Paul is doing their neighborhood zoning study there were the single family zoning that was done a lot throughout the city. There had been zoning in an area where you'd have a duplex, but then I think in the 70s, they flipped it to, oh no, you can only have single family zone or single family homes here. But the city of St. Paul is now looking at flipping it back to, you know, this was a traditional multifamily zoning house. So there's a lot of current information. I think we have something, a recording on the website too, for those surveys that have been going through for the last couple of years with that. So there has been some acknowledgement that part of that went from, you couldn't do redlining, you couldn't do covenants as of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. Then zoning came into play that, no, we want single family homes with this sort of amenities. You have to have a brick front. You have to have this much land in your lot. Those sort of things are zoning sort of qualifiers. And then they're flipping back now that it's like, no, that doesn't make sense. We need, you know, more concentrated housing close to transit lines and hubs and different things like that.
Other questions or comments? Yeah,
Mine is different.
that's fine.
Back to the charts from the Como High School
Yeah.
data. You said white and black. I know there's a lot of people of color that Como, and I wondered if you did just look at black students, or did you, I mean, I thought maybe you say white and non-white, so that you could include a larger group of people of color. It's just a thought.
So we did actually look, I mean, we didn't create that data. So, I mean, the public schools are required to provide data on graduation rates, and they have to provide that data cut by race. And so, if you go to the link that's on the slide, it's like the citation on the slide, you can cut that graduation data in a number of different ways. So you can look at it as just an overall graduation rate, and then you can also look at it by different racial groups. You're gonna have to help me remember to make sure I'm gonna say this right. I'm pretty certain, like we looked, one of the groups, so there's a variety of racial groups that you can look at. There's also a category for like 2 or more racial groups for someone who might identify as being biracial. My recollection is that we looked at the rates of Asian students graduating, and they were quite high. They were similar to the white students graduating. But the tricky thing about data is, right, depending on how you sort of cut the data, you see different things, right? So if you only look at the data as the overall graduation rate, you miss the sort of disparity here, which is pretty startling, right? So it's just a way to sort of think about, or a way to sort of inkle at the idea that these racial inequities that existed in our communities in the past still have legacies today. And so you have to think about that if you want to build a different community.
Another way to look at that is to say, well, if you pull it all together and you have, obviously, it's going to be a lower graduation rate overall than 90%, right? What was the overall
I think when you
graduation?
pulled it all together, it's like, if you don't cut it by race, I think it's a 75% graduation rate overall.
So then saying, well, by not improving graduation rates for people of color, it brings down everybody. No, it brings everything down. So,
Well, it brings the graduation rate down, I mean, that's true, like,
Yeah.
mathematically, that's true, but
but
like,
societally,
yeah, but these students are graduating, right, like, however the overall number changes, they graduate by and large.
Well, I brought it up because it's just another way to hide data as far as I mean, it's another way to do what we've been talking about, all these other methods for, doing things that they shouldn't be doing and covering it up with data that looks good. I'm not saying this is bad data, I'm just saying it's so easy to manipulate data. And if a report goes to somebody saying that the graduation rate is 75%, wow, all the schools are failing. Well, it's unfortunate because I think this is the kind of stuff we're fed on a regular basis.
Well, it sort of gets at Ava's point about being a critical consumer of, right, all the different kinds of media and information, right, and thinking about the different kinds of questions we should ask.
Right.
Casey, it looks like you might
I'm
add
just
something.
gonna quickly interject a little more detail. One, you can easily find this page if you just search St. Paul Public Schools graduation rates. And then you can scroll down and actually see the composition of overall who graduated by race, like just in a sort of color graph, which can give you a little bit of a better idea about why it gets dragged down and stuff like that. And it was very interesting to look at, so I absolutely recommend going around and fucking with those values.
So we should go out to see the full data, not just a summary.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's see, the person, did you ever know? You sure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Question, did you guys research just being in the Como area, or was it all the same thing?
So in terms of sort of the work we're going to do with schools and looking at the history of school desegregation and its relationship to neighborhood segregation, the archival research that we did wasn't only focused on Como, it was more broadly focused. We thought we'd start with the St. Paul Public School District, right? It's independent school districts. 625, that we'd start with that. We sort of highlighted some of what we saw in Como because that's where we are tonight. But the idea for this work, and it'll get picked up in the fall, I'll continue to work with a group of students. And then Dr. Christine West, the economist, will pick up the work too with a group of students. We'll sort of look at that a little more holistically. But, research is always a slower process than you want it to be. So it just takes time.
I was just wondering, as you're going into schools and neighborhoods, if you've seen a difference, more racial issues coming about in certain schools, certain neighborhoods. As you
Yeah.
So you can sort of see like maybe on Como or Central, Harding, Jersey School, you see particular areas are seeing this more racial prevalence and things of that nature. And to me, like, if I was doing, it'd even be more interesting to say, okay, if these covenants of creating these houses, are they being passed down through family members that is keeping this cycle and this system going?
Oh, so the covenants definitely work, because the covenants, the thing about a covenant, about racial covenants, is that in the early part of the 20th century, racial covenants were legally very strong ways to claim property as white property, because the covenant ran with the land, not with the person who owned the house. So it didn't matter who owned the house. Once a covenant was on the house, the covenant stayed. And in fact, there were, like, technically, legally, the first homeowner, there's a covenant on the house, then they sell the house, the next homeowner says, I disagree with this and I'm selling the house to whoever I want. Technically, if they sold the house to a person of color, the property should technically revert back to the original owners of the original owner's heirs, because the covenant runs with the land. Covenants, though, so in the Shelley versus Kramer case that Casey referenced, which is a Supreme Court case in the late 1940s, that case rules that covenants are not enforceable. In 1953, I think it is, or it's in the early 1950s, Minnesota actually passes a state law that says you can't add new covenants. But we know from the work of the Mapping Prejudice Project, who's been mapping the presence of racial covenants in our community, that we see racial covenants being added on properties in Ramsey County up until 1960. So 7 years after this law in Minnesota is passed. The Fair Housing Act that passes in the 60s as part of the Civil Rights Act, that act names racial covenants as illegal, right? So they're illegal and unenforceable today, but they do still have legacies in our community today. So a group of economists did some work looking at the value of houses. And what they discovered is that today, right now, in this moment where racial covenants are illegal and unenforceable and have been so for almost 50 years, homes that had these racial covenants in the past are worth, it's like 17 or 18% more today than comparable homes that didn't have racial covenants, right? So that just then reinforces, right, generational wealth for white folks who could live in these houses and their houses grew in value, whereas people of color could not buy these homes because they had covenants. Even today, there's still sort of impacts there.
I think you bring up a really good point, though, of the generational, like the family handing down that too, because that has, in this neighborhood, there's many families who generationally, as part of our interviews, have lived here for 3 or 4 or 5 generations. And so if whether covenants are there or not, that perpetuates going through, and they like to stay here so their friends come here. So it's just a real interesting concept to layering it down.
And I want to commend you for taking on education, because I think it's critical in this discussion. But I would really encourage you to take a deep dive on special education, because that plays a major factor. And you also have to look carefully at the funding, because $1 in one school is not equivalent to $1 in another school. And there's some significant inequalities in how that gets parsed out.
Well, right, it goes back to those property values, which are in part propped up in some neighborhoods because of racial covenants in the past, which then means those neighborhoods, some neighborhoods have more funding, right? Their dollars are worth more than other places.
So I just had a question about the legal landscape of the deeds.
Yeah.
So because the language is still in place in the deeds and they're not enforceable, but that's just by law, and laws change. And we've seen that happen in our own, in this last year with other things changing, that we've had rights to for 50 years.
Yes.
So why is it so hard to just sweep the deeds clean of that language? Instead, each homeowner has to do it themselves. when the sale of the house happens, that's when it's easiest to remove the language, but like, why is that so hard? Why can't it just be swept clean and change the deeds to eliminate the covenants?
So I'm gonna give an answer as a historian, which maybe is not the fairest answer, but I'm gonna wear my historian hat for a minute. As a historian, I would say we shouldn't erase the language from the deeds, because if we erase the language from the deeds, we can forget that it was there. Right, the record lives in a different way in a different place. This is actually, there are conversations about racial covenants happening all across the United States today. Communities are wrestling with them in different ways. So in the state of Minnesota, we have this process where a homeowner can discharge a racial covenant in a property deed, which just adds language to your property deed if you had a racial covenant that says you disavow this language. In other places, like county, like property records officers have basically been tasked with like going and finding all the racial covenants and just like erasing them, just like deleting them out. And right then there are questions about like, how do we find them again to remember that this was part of the history?
Okay, I mean, I understand that you want to have a historical record, but there's a way to do that without having them still in the deed, right?
Some places have been trying to figure out what that way is. It's tricky though to figure it out. And it's tricky because sometimes different people are involved in the conversation about how those decisions get made, and different people, different groups bring different knowledge to the table. So sometimes when in different places they've sort of, county commissioner's office or a legislature has said delete these things, sometimes they're just thinking about how you get rid of them and then not thinking about the repercussions of like, how do we keep a record of them, right? Because again, people, you know what you know, and people bring different knowledge to the table. So.
Is there any statistical data findable to show that now that families have the kids can choose which high school to go to in the city? Has that improved desegregation or not?
We have to look, but it's also the case that you can't do that everywhere. Like I live in a school district where there is no open enrollment is not a possibility.
Right.
So, it's a tricky thing. And that's part of what makes the sort of education landscape here an interesting one to think about, right? St. Paul, in my understanding, is one of the first places to have a charter school. So, we also have this robust charter school system, and that is a history and a story that intersects with race as well. And so again, we're just at the beginning of sort of thinking about this and trying to untangle some of the threads and think about what the stories are there, but it's complicated, so.
Not enough. Reduce segregation, more segregated schools, instead of helping the public schools to get better. You charter schools, isolate the groups and segregate, and that's part of the problem.
They can, but for me, I come back to the question of, when you look at a map of our neighborhoods, a lot of neighborhoods are still segregated today. And if neighborhoods are a big part of what determines where someone goes to school, how do you solve the problem of school segregation if the thing that creates it are the neighborhoods in which you live, right?
Don't build it. The German school, those people, they don't live here, they move here, they put it there. They're from Greenland.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight and thank our guests from St. Kate's for working with us this summer. I know we went long, but the discussion was very robust and very interesting. And the idea with the Como Neighborhood History Project is to
uncover the fun history as well as finding out things that make us a little bit more uncomfortable from time to time. It's an open project for anyone. It's kind of linked with the Know Your Como. So if there's stories people want to write themselves and Know Your Como, reach out that way. I think we'll wrap this up now in case we have maybe we can go a few minutes on our neighborhood relations meeting, but for people who'd like to need to stretch, get up, it's time to go. I just want to thank you all for coming and thank you for joining D10. It's an awesome organization.